Well, I first want to thank Helene and David for the opportunity to come and talk today. It's a thrill for me to have a chance to speak to so many colleagues who've either directly had an important impact on my career or who I've been citing for my entire career. So I'm thrilled to be here and have the opportunity to present on this topic today. So briefly, what I'm going to try to do is cover several topics. One is talk about the drinking rates among college athletes, also talk about some of the theoretical explanations for college athlete drinking, particularly in terms of trying to explain some of the differences we see between athletes and non-athletes. But then spend most of the time in the talk talking about the literature on alcohol interventions for college athletes, and then some potential future clinical and research directions. One of the things about this area, especially in comparison to some of the things we heard from, some of the areas we heard from yesterday, is that there haven't been very many studies in this area. So the studies that have been done, I'll be able to talk about in a little bit of detail and actually cover each one individually, including a recent trial that I completed. But going to spend, therefore, a little bit more time in terms of talking about some of the implications, some of the potential future directions that we need to go in this particular area. So one of the things we know about alcohol use among college athletes is that studies consistently indicate that college athletes drink more than other students. Here we're talking about sort of formally defined athletes in terms of those participating in a NCAA or NAIA sport, although there's some evidence that suggests we're also seeing similar patterns among recreational or club sport athletes. When you look at the overall percentage of athletes versus non-athletes that report using any alcohol, in general what you find are fairly similar percentages. So it's not like a significantly higher percentage of athletes are using alcohol than non-athletes. The prevalence rates are about the same. But when you look at the actual drinking rates, this is where the differences emerge. So these data are percentage of students who endorsed heavy episodic or binge drinking in the past 2 weeks. You see that both for males and females, the athletes are reporting, or a higher percentage of athletes are reporting binge drinking than non-athletes. Another interesting way to look at this data, I think, is that the percentages for male non-athletes are roughly equivalent to the percentages of female athletes. So that kind of gives you a sort of a perspective on the heavy drinking rates. Get a similar pattern when you look at frequent heavy episodic drinking or frequent binge drinking in the past 2 weeks. Athletes reporting, or a greater percentage of athletes reporting engaging in that behavior than non-athletes. Not surprisingly, you also see that athletes are more likely to experience negative alcohol-related consequences than non-athletes. This study was kind of interesting in that Licklider et al., they used the core data and tried to break athletes down by team leaders versus team members. So team leaders are folks like team captains and people in those types of positions, and they expected to find that team members would report higher alcohol use than team leaders. In fact, they found the opposite phenomenon, where all athletes reported or were more likely to experience negative consequences than non-athletes. They had higher drinking rates, drinks per week was higher, but then the team leaders also, they had rates that were elevated above and beyond the team members. So that kind of gives us a little picture of what the pattern looks like. I presented data from national studies. There are a number of studies out there that are more local from individual campuses where you see the same pattern. I've seen it in my data. So we have a pretty good evidence that for whatever reason, college athletes are reporting higher drinking rates than non-athletes. So this leads us to the next logical question of why. Okay, so why is it that college athletes are drinking more than other students? Number of theories are out there. Unfortunately, there's very little data on this topic. So we'll talk a little bit about the theoretical reasons, but it's important to keep in mind that we really don't know a ton for sure about the role of these factors. So one thing that you've seen in the literature for a number of years is excessive stress. So the idea is that, well, athletes are under more stress than non-athletes. They have to balance academics and athletics and the stress of athletic performance and all that kind of stuff. So that's why maybe that's one of the reasons why they drink more than other athletes. Unfortunately, it's not well supported. When you look at studies that have, with athletes that have included measures of coping-related motives, you get generally low endorsement rates that are similar to what you see in populations of non-athletes. One study, one of the only studies that had athletes and non-athletes on that included measures like drinking motives, found no athlete, non-athlete differences on a drinking to relax measure, which might suggest, a need to drink to deal with excessive stress. But as I mentioned, no well-designed study has addressed this issue. This is something I'll talk a little bit more about later, but we really need a study where we have kind of a large, randomly selected sample or kind of population study where we're not just collecting data on alcohol use rates, but all these other variables that may be associated with alcohol use, where we could make some meaningful comparisons between athletes and non-athletes. Another theory that's out there are characteristics of athletic teams. So perhaps it's something unique to athletic teams that causes college athletes to drink more than other students. So people have talked about excessive peer pressure or injunctive norms. So perhaps on athletic teams there are very high levels of pressure to drink, permissiveness associated with drinking, those sorts of things. Others have talked about the issue of competitiveness. So athletes, it's generally accepted that they're pretty competitive people. And I've heard this anecdotally from folks that I've worked with clinically, that, well, maybe it becomes, drinking becomes a competition. If I go out and, my teammates had 4 shots, I'm going to have 5 shots. And then since I've had 5, he's going to have 7. And, it pretty much spirals out of control. But again, and I'm going to try to not sound like a broken record here, but the research is really sparse in this area. It's things that people have talked about, but we really don't know a ton for sure. One thing that there's a little more data on, although it's not great, is the issue of seasonal status, particularly in season versus off season. So there's some data, including one study that I did, a small sample. I think it's the only one I'm aware of that's really looked at this longitudinally. The data do suggest that college athletes drink less during their competitive seasons, which is good. I mean, this is something that we hope happens and something that makes sense, but does this mean there's a kind of a makeup time in the off season? Again, anecdotally, working clinically with athletes, a lot of them say, once the season's over, this is when I can be a regular college student, and in their mind, maybe a regular college student can drink a lot, go out and party, those sorts of things. I used to do some work with wrestlers, and wrestlers live a very strange life during their competitive season. They basically all have eating disorders, except for the heavyweights. They don't eat. They restrict their calories. They restrict their drinking, and then they pretty much lose their minds for a couple of weeks once the season ends. They gain like 25 pounds. They go out, and drink heavily. So just kind of an illustrative example of, what might be going on here. And some of the data that Kim Fromey presented yesterday about, if your normal drinking level is here during the athletic season, and then as soon as the season's over, we really kind of go above our established norm. Perhaps that's an explanation for some of the things we see. A final thing that people have talked about, a little bit tougher to define or operationalize, is the general cultural factors associated with athletics. In this country and in other countries, in European nations, it's actually might be a little bit more intimate. There's clearly a link between alcohol and athletics. I mean, turn on ESPN for 15 minutes and try not to see a Budweiser or a Coors commercial or whoever happens to be sponsoring that particular sport. I grew up in St. Louis and go to Busch Stadium for for baseball games. Certainly there are social links between college sports and alcohol. I know some people in this room have done studies in this area of the tailgating phenomenon. I mean, hopefully the athletes themselves aren't, tailgating, but given the way the Missouri football team has played over the years, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised. Drinking rates, I'm sure during the Final Four this year here at Duke, we might have seen a little bit more drinking than normal. So there's, what's it like for an individual who grows up in an athletic culture and identifies strongly as an athlete and has this link between athletics and alcohol for the entire time of basically his or her existence in sport? We don't know. People have also speculated about kind of more social opportunities for college athletes based on the culture of athletics in terms of how we look at athletes. When I was a graduate student at Missouri, after a football game, one of our rare victories at that time, was at a bar downtown and saw some of the football players like behind the bar serving themselves the drinks. Pretty sure most students don't get the opportunity after a football game to just go behind the bar at Harpo's and kind of pass out whatever they wanted to do. So certainly things like this exist for athletes compared to non-athletes in general. So is this something that plays a role? But again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a need for well-controlled studies designed to answer some of these questions. We really don't know with any degree of certainty how these factors are really associated with drinking among athletes. So one area that I think this field needs to go is trying to figure out a little bit more about some of these factors that may help explain these differences, explain these heavy rates among athletes, which may help to serve the intervention efforts of those of us that are trying to work with this population. So we're going to switch gears now, talk more about the studies that have looked at intervention efforts among college athletes. As I said before, there's only a handful of studies that have been conducted in this area. The earliest study that I'm aware of is Marcello et al. In 1989. Looked at it's kind of hard to tell from the description in the journal, but it seemed to be kind of an education and somewhat of a skills-based program, similar to some of the models that Mary Larimer was talking about yesterday. Didn't find any effects for that particular program, but a number of considerable limitations to this study. This is going to be a broken record for some of these studies, that the intervention studies that have been conducted, many of them have a number of considerable limitations. This study had a very small number of subjects, low response rate, high attrition, sort of like the kind of a triple whammy there. If you have small subjects, low responses, and high attrition, it's going to sort of be hard to include anything, but they did get it published, so that was pretty exciting. There have been two more recent studies that have looked at the effects of campus-wide social norms campaigns. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you in this room, are familiar with this model of presenting normative information about alcohol use among a certain population in a variety of means campus-wide. There have been two studies that I'm aware of that have looked at social norms campaigns targeted directly towards athletes. The first, the Toms and Hamilton study, they examined one campus, got a social norms campaign, and then they compared it to athletes at two other campuses that did not get a social norms campaign. And so they looked at differences between the exposed versus the non-exposed students, found no between-group differences on alcohol consumption. They did find between-group differences in normative perceptions. So those who were exposed to the social norms campaign had more accurate perceptions of the normative information, but there were no between-group differences in drinking rates. More recently, Perkins and Craig examined changes over time among college athletes at a single university. So what they did in this study was institute a social norms campaign, and I can't remember the year, say it was something like 2003 or 2004, got baseline drinking among athletes, and then looked at different cohorts of athletes over time, over the next several years that they ran the intervention. This social norms campaign was extensively targeted towards athletes. If you look at the description, they really spent a lot of time thinking about how they could make this information salient to athletes. The way that it was targeted made it particularly relevant towards that group. And the authors did find less drinking and lower normative perceptions post-intervention compared to pre-intervention. So the cohorts of athletes that answered the surveys in, say, 2005, 2006, after the study was implemented or the campaign was implemented, reported less drinking than the baseline sample. But these two studies are limited by several important factors. The Thompson-Hamilton study had non-random assignment to conditions, so the campus that got the social norms campaign versus the other campus, it was campuses of convenience, I guess you'd describe it. The Perkins and Craig study had no control condition, which obviously limits anything we can say about causality. And then Perkins and Craig also looked at cohort rather than individual data. So they didn't track individual subjects over time. They just looked at the cohort in 2004 versus 2005 and 2006, which obviously has some limitations associated with it. So I think that the targeted nature, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this with the study that I just completed. I think the targeted nature of the intervention has some promise, but the design of this particular study kind of really limits what we can conclude. And then there's two studies that have examined the effectiveness of personalized drinking feedback. Again, Mary was talking about this yesterday, looking at feedback only, the personalized feedback that had been developed as part of like the basics model that was used initially in the context of a one-on-one intervention. We have two studies that have examined the effects of just providing that feedback in college athlete populations. The first study, Dumas, and I'm going to guess Haustveit, but that's just a shot in the dark. Participants in this study were randomized to either a web-based personalized drinking feedback or a web-based education condition. You can see the PDF condition included kind of the typical stuff, normative comparisons, financial costs of alcohol, kind of these sorts of things that we saw some illustrations of yesterday. Results did indicate between group changes in alcohol use and perceived drinking among other students among at-risk drinkers. So the heaviest drinkers in the sample, there were intervention effects, I think it was at 3 months, between the PDF group and the education-only group. The study was limited by low follow-up rate, only 33 at follow-up, so about 60%. But it did show that this personalized drinking feedback intervention that had been shown to be, in some studies, effective among non-athlete or general college students did work among college athletes as well. And then my study that was recently accepted, Jason Kilmer was a co-investigator on this study. We conducted a larger trial of web-delivered PDF interventions that included 3 conditions. One was a PDF-targeted intervention. So what we tried to do in this condition was develop information that was both relevant to general reasons for drinking, but tried to develop some content that was also more specific to athletes. A PDF standard condition, which involves the typical information that you would provide to any college drinker, and then an education-only condition that also included some targeted information. So it was just education, but it was educational information that was designed to be particularly relevant to athletes. So you can see what was in the PDF standard condition, kind of your typical information. In the targeted condition, we tried to come up with some feedback that we thought would be particularly relevant to athletes, and perhaps we can talk a little bit more about this in the questions, or I can speculate a little bit about this. I think this might be an interesting direction to go of trying to develop and think about ways that we can make this information even more targeted. What we did in this study is social norms were specific to college athletes as opposed to college students in general, the idea being that if this norm is more relevant, perhaps it'll be more likely to impact behavior. We developed a measure of athlete-specific negative alcohol-related consequences. So athletes in this condition receive feedback on both general kind of consequences associated with alcohol use as well as athlete-specific consequences. The potential impact of athletic performance on heavy drinking. This is sort of difficult to quantify, but there are some estimates out there about, if you engage in a single heavy episodic drinking episode, it's going to, potentially impact your performance for 2 days. If you engage in back-to-back, it's potentially going to impact your performance for up to 5 days, I think. I can't remember the specifics. So athletes who drank in that manner received that type of feedback. And anecdotally, again, going back to some clinical work with athletes, I think that this may really be an area that we can exploit, because when you talk to athletes about the way that they're drinking could be impacting their performance, many of them really have no clue. They just assume, oh my goodness, I can do whatever. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And then the educational only condition included information specific to college athletes. Some of the information that was included in the PDF targeted, but just in educational format. So we were able to make 2 comparisons. One, comparing the PDF targeted versus a PDF standard, so looking at the targeted information in that context, but then also we were interested in the contrast between the PDF targeted versus the education only, because both of those conditions contained the targeted information. So we found some effects, particularly in the area of peak BAC. You can see here that at 6 months, the targeted group had a slight decrease among the full sample, where the other 2 groups had relatively substantial increases. We also found effects similar to what was reported in the Dumas study, in terms of we had stronger effects among our heaviest drinkers. So here, for 1 month peak BAC, you can see the targeted, pretty substantial decrease, whereas the other 2 conditions had relatively modest decreases. A little bit of a different pattern at 6 month BAC among our heaviest drinkers. You can see the targeted group, still a pretty good decrease. Also had a similar decrease in the PDF standard, while in the education only, 6 month peak BAC actually went up. For this contrast, the difference between PDF targeted and education only was statistically significant, whereas the other contrasts weren't. Then we also had a 1 month effect for just in-season athletes in terms of drinks per week. This was a smaller subsample, which kind of explains why we kind of have this goofy, where the education-only group had a lower baseline rate. But we do see that in the PDF targeted versus PDF standard, kind of starting at the same point, considerably stronger decrease for the PDF targeted group. So where does this leave us in terms of future directions? I do think that there's potentially some promise for these targeted interventions. Frankly, we didn't do a ton of targeted information in this first study. It was the first study that we're aware of that really tried to do this type of stuff. So I think we know a little bit more about ways that we might be able to target this to make it more effective for athletes. I was listening to people yesterday talk about sleep, and it's like, never dawned on me, but that's so important to athletes and athletic performance that, that may be a way to kind of refine these interventions. I do think that the reason perhaps the effects were strongest for the peak BAC item is perhaps that's what really kind of stands out for athletes in terms of athletic performance. They may not think about, the days they have 4 or 5 drinks and, are okay the next morning, they get up and train or whatever, but it may be the days that they have 8, 10, 12 drinks and then they wake up and have to go run or something like that that may be particularly painful. So perhaps doing some more kind of refinement or analyses in that area. So examining some of the potential active ingredients in these interventions, I think, is certainly an important way to go. Mary was talking about that yesterday as well. Extending these to in-person MI-based interventions. I mean, we've done this trial with the PDF-only intervention. Then you have the Dumas study, but we haven't had the in-person kind of replication. In some ways, we went backwards here. Then the rest of the field has gone. So clearly, that's an important area to go. And then environmental strategies, and kind of really curious to hear what Bob has to say. One of the things, there's some challenges associated with athletic departments that I'm going to talk about real quick. But an athletic department culture, if you can get in, may be particularly well suited for environmental interventions. If you can get buy-in from the athletic directors and coaches, I mean, they have a lot of control over athletes. So, let's use this control for good rather than evil, potentially. There are a number of unique challenges, though, in terms of working with this population. Some of you, I know Helene and I have had a few conversations where we've complained about this. Certainly the insider-outsider culture of athletic departments. I mean, if you're not in, it can be very challenging to gain the trust, the buy-in, support, things like that. So to do work with this population, you often really have to lay a considerable amount of groundwork. Related to this is difficulty in accessing athletes. Athletes do, I think it's fair to say, have less available time than other students in general. So just kind of the general access issues. And then one thing that's kind of unique about dealing with a research project with athletes is that typically, we compensate people for their time. The NCAA does not like that with athletes. If you have a study where you're just going to use athletes, any type of compensation is considered I forget what the phrase is, a special benefit. So compliance officers typically have problems with that. So in this study, what we had to do was also include intramural and club sport athletes. Now, the data I presented were for just the NCAA athletes, although the findings are identical if you also include intramural and club sport athletes. But that can be a challenge. You want to do a large clinical trial on your campus with athletes. I mean, you're going to have to figure out how to motivate them to participate. And then just a few acknowledgments here from the funding source for my clinical trial, as well as my co-authors on the study that we just completed. How'd I do? The end.